Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Ramsey. I'm an event staffer at Politics and Prose bookstore, where we host in-person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We've recently relocated both our branch locations at Union Market and the Wharf, and have started hosting events there as well. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politicsandprose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so not to disrupt the event. The Q&A mic is going to be at this stand right here, so you guys can just line up behind it after the moderator and the author finish their conversation. That'd be great. Following the Q&A, we have a signing up here at this table, so if you have not already purchased the book, we have many copies at the checkout from the store. We ask you to line up, and we'll come by to ask you for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we ask you to fold up your chairs and leave them against something sturdy. So now, without further ado, today I'm very excited to welcome author Becca Rothfeld, celebrating the release of All Things Are Too Small. Becca Rothfeld is a nonfiction book critic for The Washington Post and an editor at The Point and a PhD candidate in philosophy at Harvard. Winner of the 2021 Robert B. Silvers Prize for Literary Criticism, a finalist for a National Magazine Award, and two-time finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Nonya Balkan Reviewing Prize. Rothfeld has written for the New York Review for Books, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and the New York Times Book Review, among other publications. She lives in Washington, D.C. Rothfeld will be in competition with Celeste Marcus, a writer and artist based in Washington, D.C., who serves as a managing editor for Liberty's Journal. She is currently working on her biography, Chom Sotin. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Becca Rothfeld and Celeste Marcus.
Hi, everybody. This is so high. It's excessively high. Are these on? Is this?
Yes.
Can you hear us okay?
Amazing.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here talking to Becca about her very first book. I've been waiting to hold this thing for as long as she's been working on it, and it is extremely beautiful.
As are you, Celeste.
Oh, as are you, Becca. I loved reading this book so much. It was so much like talking to Becca, which is to say it was an extremely intense experience. I did have the feeling while reading it that I wanted to want to read it and also to be reading it and also to be doing nothing else but reading it, much like the things in this book that Becca loves excessively.
Thematically resonant with the content of the book.
Yeah,
that feeling.
I'm riffing. So I've read the book and reread parts of it, and there are lots of pieces in it that are consistent with the overall theme, and then there are pieces that seem to me to be inconsistent with it. For example, Becca is advocating for excess and advocating for possessing far more than we could ever actually hold in our hands, eating more than we can actually intake, and loving more compulsively than we ever actually could dedicate our time to, doing things that are not just illogical but completely impossible. And she's also advocating, not just out loud and overtly, but also stylistically, for rigor. And of course, she's a critic, and the art of criticism is also about culling. So I wonder if when you set out to write this, you found that there was some kind of tension between those two things. And I guess another way of asking this question is, let's do it this way. What do Simone Weil and David Cronenberg have in common?
That's a great question, a great way to put it. I think that they're both extreme in one way or another. Simone Weil is kind of an extreme minimalist. She's maximalist in her minimalism. If you all don't know who Simone Weil is, she is a French mystic who was really extreme, who arguably starved herself to death. She wouldn't eat more than her compatriots in France during World War II did. And so she's kind of, I think I call her in my review of one of her books, which I didn't like, but kind of admire, a shriek of a human being. And I think that David Cronenberg has a similarly maximalist ethos, although in a completely different way, as do many of the other artists and writers that I talk about in the book. I think they all have their own maximalisms. His is very bodily and fleshly. Hers is kind of an attempt to get rid of her body via starvation and self-abnegation of various kinds. But they both have an extreme and very idiosyncratic vision.
Right. And I think that that's like the book is in some ways portraits of a series of personalities that you were drawn to, I think, because you felt you identified with that intensity in them, though they might not have had anything polite to say to one another.
And I also say Simone Weil is secretly hungry, that like she starves herself because she's hungry for celestial food, because like no food on earth can sate her enormous appetites. And she would probably disagree with that characterization. She probably conceives of herself as someone who genuinely wants to do away with her appetites. But I sort of read her against herself, and I think there are textual resources for that in Simone Weil.
Well, I think that like there's never a time, even when you're writing about somebody else, when your interpretation of them isn't like you feel you preside over all of these people, even when you're paying them respect, or maybe especially when you're paying them respect.
That's what criticism is, baby. Yeah. Presiding over people.
But especially like you claim them, I feel more emphatically when you identify with them than when you're castigating them for being ordinary. Like you have a lot less to say. You have a lot less dominion over Sally Rooney than you do over Simone Weil.
I don't know about that.
You don't think so?
No, I do. I agree with what you're trying to say.
You wouldn't even care to possess her,
yes,
you know?
I would not care to possess Sally Rooney. That is correct.
So this is what I'm wondering. It's like here, I guess another way of approaching the same question is the book is about so many things, but one of the things that it is about is how to desire. And desire as an imperative, as a way of life. And you don't talk about how to cultivate the capacity in the reader. And I kind of feel like somebody who is reading the book and who doesn't have the capacity to feel as intensely as you do is only going like, do you wonder about that? This book is not instruction. It's not injunction. It's descriptive, and it's description of a capacity that you have. And I don't know if you care whether or not other people can rise to it or sink to it.
I think I do care. I mean, I think the book is an attempt at evocation. And like one of the arguments I make in the book is that beauty elicits desire. And that's Simone Weil's argument as well. And we want to do something with beauty. We don't know exactly what we want to do with beauty. And so we try to eat it, is what she says. So the book itself is an attempt to elicit those appetites. It's an attempt to be beautiful. And whether I succeed, you all will have to judge. But it's an attempt to awaken that kind of desire via evocative language. So I think a critic is always simultaneously describing, evoking, and evaluating, even in essays that aren't strictly critical, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I think it's sort of an exploration of what to do with desire once you already have it too. Like there's different things that you can do with your desire. Simone Weil says again that your desire for beauty is frustrated because you can't possess the beautiful object, you can't eat it. So what do you do to it? And I think you do criticism to it. Okay. And I think that the book, I mean, that's like the best we can do. We eat things by criticizing them. And that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Okay, it's interesting that you say that because she doesn't say that in the book.
Not in so many words.
She shows it, and you have this feeling like there's this tension in the book. There's so many tensions in this book, but one of them is that you have this feeling while you're reading it that this thing that she is telling you to do, which is to feel deeply and to put yourself in the way of things that are going to make you feel deeply. The only thing that's going to make you feel deeply is this book, you know? Like it's like she makes this point about Simone Weil. Becca makes this point where she's explaining that they didn't want the food. She wanted to want the food, right? I mean,
I think she wants both of those things. She wants to be able to eat the food and for the food to continue existing. She's like dedicated both to the object of her desire and to her desire itself. And so that's why no earthly food can satisfy her, because when we eat it, we deplete it. But that's not true of the food of heaven. And I think that that's not true of art either. And so that's why I think art is the perfect object of an appetite. There's nothing that we can do to diminish the art.
So while reading, I did wonder, in desire, is desire about the object, the subject, or the desire itself?
Probably different desires have different structures, but I do think that my own desire, as explored in this book, is for the object, and in particular for the object to transform me. I think that's also what criticism is a lot of the time, is sort of a record of the way in which you have been transformed via your encounter with an object. And that's also my account of erotic desire as articulated in this book. There's many essays about how erotic exchange is transformative in much the same way that a jolting encounter with an artwork can be.
Do you think that desire done correctly is transformative?
Yes, of course, there are also sort of acquisitive desires, where what you want is to impose your own conception of something onto someone. And that's a bad kind of desire. I talk about how that's the wrong way to go about an erotic exchange in the book, whereas the right way to go about an erotic exchange is by adducing a willingness to be surprised and thereby transformed.
And so that is predicated on some kind of intellectual equality between the object and the subject.
Yes, there's one essay in this book that's otherwise a celebration of different kinds of inequalities. That is a celebration of a particular kind of equality. And it's the equality that I think must obtain between people in a romantic relationship in order for other kinds of disproportion and excess to flourish. There has to be a baseline of equality.
There are things in the book, there are essays in the book that are about like absence. I'm thinking about the Marie Kondo. Is that how you say her name?
I think Marie Kondo is how you say her name, yeah.
Sure. Minimalism, or about...
She is the antagonist of one essay in the book, and also just general antagonist in My Cluttered Life.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about about that essay, so that people have context for the question that I'm going to ask, which is, what does clutter have to do with all of this?
Yes. So that essay is not just about Marie Kondo. It's about all of these declutterers. So I read like 20 decluttering manuals or something.
You poor woman.
I am a martyr to the cause of criticism. I read a lot of books about decluttering, and I liken them to a contemporary strain in fiction, the fragment novel, which are these novels that are written in fragments, obviously, I guess. They don't have tons of plot. They kind of just are short aphoristic segments. An example is Drifts by Kate Zambrino. And so the essay claims that the urge that declutterers are evincing is similar to the urge that these novelists are evincing. They tell you to keep what you need, but not what you want. And this is a maxim that recurs over and over in a lot of these decluttering books. They say, keep what you need, don't keep what you want. It's this very utilitarian way of approaching possession. And I think that these books are similar. They have the rudiments of a novel and no more. Just enough to create a book and nothing excessive. And I think that the glory of a novel consists in the excessiveness of the form. The novel is maybe arguably the most excessive form. You think of something like Proust or Moby Dick, like that's a novel taken to its fullest extent. And these novels are kind of the antithesis of that. So I liken these two things to each other.
But there is, in art and in serious art, there is a kind of minimalism that does demand a lot from us. I mean, I'm thinking of like Brancusi or the Cycladics or Mondrian, or like haikus, that where the simplicity is itself exacting. Is that inconsistent with what you're saying?
No, I don't think so, because I think that I conceive of maximalism in this book as gratuitousness. It's a book in favor of more than we need. It's not a book in favor necessarily of large things or lots of things, but just in favor of gratuities, the gratuities that make us human. I think all art is just a paradigm example of this. Like, we don't need art to survive in a strict sense. We don't need it to subsist. Like, our bodies will continue without art, and yet it is what humanizes us. It's in that excess that we become human, is the claim of the book. So that's why I think that things like Kafka's shortest stories, like Before the Law, which is basically just an aphorism, is excessive in my sense, because it is gratuitous. Also because it invokes this kind of like nightmarish geography where there are doors behind doors infinitely. So that's another kind of excess sort of enfolded into the content of the story. But anyway,
But it would have been true of any excellent short story, insofar as it is not necessary, but it is excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true of like all non-didactic art. And because I have to talk about Kant in like every talk that I ever have, I think this is one amazing thing that Kant says, is that the aesthetic mode is one in which we are looking at things in and of themselves and striving to value them in and of themselves and not as means to the end of something else.
But in an age where we are clotted with stuff that is often gratuitous, how do you champion excess?
I think you write a book about it. But I think a lot of the stuff that we are cluttered with is not gratuitous. I think we're cluttered with a lot of attempts at optimization. Like, there are lots of things that we're told to buy and do because these things will optimize our lives. Apps that you download to monitor your sleep, which I don't do, but they're supposed to improve.
As you don't sleep.
As I don't sleep, I look at the apps in an attempt to optimize my not sleeping. These are the kinds of things I think that we're told to accumulate. I don't think that there is a lot of emphasis on the accumulation of gratuities, like art, erotic encounter among them. Art in particular, I think didactic art, there's a lot of didactic art, which is utilitarian, but I don't think that there's a lot of emphasis on gratuities.
But there's also a lot of bad art that's not didactic, and you're not making an argument for that stuff in the book.
Well, certainly not. I mean, I'm not making an argument just in favor of all maximalism, but of course, good maximalism. And that's why all of the essays in the book are about particular things. There's no essay that's about maximalism in general. Many of them are arguments against particular things. So there's one against fragment novels and decluttering. There's another one against mindfulness and meditation. There's one against certain kinds of puritanical aversions to sex, and so on.
And when you sat down and set out to write this book, did you pick as subject, well, how did you pick your subjects?
I think my subjects picked me. This book is partially essays that had been previously published and partially new essays. And so as I was writing the previously published essays, I just began to notice that there were themes calcifying. And so I took note of the themes that were calcifying, and I kind of let them lead me to the idea of the collection.
But there's a philosophy that undergirds the whole thing. Did you realize that after you started like tying these knots together?
Yeah, I did. I mean, the strand of gratuity, I now realize, is at the core of my conception of maximalism, that it's not just bigness, it's the excessiveness, more than you needness, that appeals to me about maximalism. But I didn't really realize that until I finished the essays.
Wow.
And this is I think in writing, which is why I'm kind of averse to talking, although I do it when my publicists make me, for example, right now, because I kind of am unable to think unless I do it on the page. And so I don't know who I am or what I think until I sit down to write things, and that's how I figure it out.
But in the book, you see, and you have like a paper trail of how this compulsion in you is an essential part of you and always has been. But you didn't realize that until you tried to figure out what your first book should be?
No, I don't think so. And further, I don't even think I realized that until I finished writing the book and went back and reread it. I mean, I think that there's just no other way to be a person besides writing a book.
So you wrote this book, which has a good bit about religion in it and a fair bit about politics in it, although those two things are never the sole subject of any one essay. They usually are interwoven into other things, and they always are, actually. I think that virtually every single essay in some way touches on philosophy, in some ways touches on politics, and in some ways touches on religion, or both of those things. But we're living in a time when there are like overlapping religious and political frenzies that are definitely serious, that are definitely the product of fanatics who have given themselves over excessively to their faith. Is there something dangerous? If someone were to live fully according to the principles laid out in this book, would they have to become fanatic in a way that would be dangerous for the common man?
Well, I think you have to be fanatical about something. I mean, I think it's pretty dangerous to have no fanatical passions. But of course, that isn't to say that you should be indiscriminate in your fanaticism. And in fact, parts of the book are in defense of judgment, in defense of discernment, in defense of basically criticism, which is in the business of constructing hierarchies of artistic objects. So I think that you should be a fanatic about David Cronenberg's movies or the films of Eric Romer, about whom I also write in the book. But you should be fanatically opposed to Marvel movies. I don't make this argument in the book, but I would be comfortable making it elsewhere. But I think that the book also dictates that there is a proper domain for excess and disproportion, and there's a domain in which those things are not proper. The book begins by saying that I'm an egalitarian politically, and I talk about John Rawls, my patron saint, and the philosopher, most important philosopher of liberalism, probably. And his view is that we should be really stringently egalitarian about political goods and economic goods, and that this kind of backdrop of egalitarianism is what allows us to be maximalist and disproportionate in our private lives or with respect to art and aesthetics. So I think that there should always be limitations on maximalism because those are proper to the sort of civic domain.
All right, you've been talking about Rawls for as long as I and maybe anybody else have known you.
I have a giant Rawls portrait in my house. Beautiful.
Several, right?
One portrait and one crochet doll that my husband commissioned for me for Valentine's Day.
That's excessive love.
Romance lives.
Were there any figures that you came across and fell in love with while writing the book that you didn't have before?
Yes, I mean David Cronenberg.
Oh my God.
Cronenberg was not in the Cronenberg is the subject of one of the longest, maybe the best essay in the collection. I had never watched a Cronenberg movie before. It wasn't in the proposal.
Why did you do it?
I try to watch a horror movie every day in October every year. Like a normal person, why not? And I watched The Fly and I was entranced, and then I watched every David Cronenberg movie and I just became obsessed with him, and it became so clear to me that this was the perfect way to write the essay that I was trying to write about transformation. Transformation and erotic experience, which I say is both a kind of grotesque and a numinous ordeal. And I think that that's exemplified perfectly in David Cronenberg's movies, where people undergo these disgusting, grotesque transformations, and yet they kind of love it and seek it out.
Yeah. She made me watch The Fly with her, which was an excessive act of friendship on my part.
It's not for the faint of heart or stomach.
Yeah. Is there any essay that, now that the book is done, you wish that you could have written for it?
Not really. I mean, there's always 1,000 essays that I want to write at any given moment, but I think I've kind of moved on from this theme to other things, other preoccupations.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had that I was just wondering while I was reading it is there's this feeling in the book that that to really consummate a desire, you have to fully possess something and then kind of create some other thing with this admixture between you and the object of the desire. And it felt as if the book was that thing for you. Did you feel that way writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always feel that way when I'm writing something. I mean, I guess I'm more than other people, and this is why I'm a professional writer. I feel like I'm always in the business of constructing myself and figuring out what I think by writing it into being. And so when I'm in the grips of some project, I always feel that we're kind of co-constitutive. That's a good question, that this transformative process is happening with writing. That also happens with art. But that also happened in lots of ways while I was writing it, because I was watching Cronenberg movies, Romer movies, because I was having all these other experiences with artworks, or not artworks, experiences with books about mindfulness or whatever. I mean, even those I was having a kind of transformative thing with.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions now. So if you have questions, there is a microphone right there.
Does your book consider the topic of the Live Forever movement? And we have a situation where science has about 4 different ways of increasing lifespan, 20% or maybe to age 150. And is that excessive? And I find that interestingly, because you mentioned you write about religion, a lot of people don't like the idea, and for spiritual reasons.
My book does not talk about that. I guess I just, unfortunately, that answer is I just have few opinions because I haven't really looked into it. I personally would like to live forever, but whether that is a good desire or not, I am not sure. Bernard Williams has an essay about this, the Macropolis case, which I've been meaning to read for a long time, but I haven't. Martha Nussbaum has an essay about this in The Therapy of Desire, where she talks about Lucretius, where she says it is reasonable to be sad if you die prematurely. I know that, so I agree with her on that. I don't know about living forever.
Hi, Becca. Hi, Celeste.
Hi.
I have a question that's going to be a catastrophe because I haven't thought it through yet. But I'm curious about...
Let's think together and
let's
transform
think
each
together.
other.
The connection between egalitarianism and minimalism. I think we're living in a moment that suffers from, certainly in aesthetics, from a kind of outrageous egalitarianism. I've met people who will insist up and down that that one kind of art isn't better than another. That
Gotta give them my book.
Michelangelo and Dragon Ball Z are basically on the same aesthetic plane. That one can't be judged. Is there a connection? I'm curious about these two trends, like how they've developed. How they developed together? Has one created the other?
Yeah. Well, the claim I make in my book is that the egalitarianism that we see in the cultural sphere is a compensatory mechanism because we, and by we I mean leftists, among whom I consider myself, are agitating for egalitarianism in the economic and political domain, but because we failed so spectacularly to achieve it, we compensate by imposing egalitarianism on domains where it has no place. So we insist that cultural objects are equal to each other, when really what we wish we could be doing is distributing wealth. And that's what we should be doing. But then we should say, like, Marvel movies are bad. Dragon Ball Z is bad. That's okay. We can say that.
Hi. As I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about the Oscar-nominated film Poor Things, which is in some way, I think, a celebration of indulgence and excess, or even social media trends. I feel like I see recently people in my generation really embracing maximalism. And so I'm wondering, do you think the cultural pendulum is sort of swinging more towards excess?
I have not seen Poor Things, but people keep telling me to because I love puff sleeves, and so I keep wearing them. This is actually the second event that I've gone. Like yesterday, someone asked me about this because they were like, "Your outfit is like from Poor Things," and I was like, "Cool, thank you." I think maybe in some ways we are tending towards maximalism, but in others maybe not quickly enough. I think in sort of the visual aesthetic domain, like the domain of fashion and makeup, that's the place where it seems to me to be palpably shifting. Like the no makeup look that some of you may not be familiar with, but that was very much the ideal with the rise of the makeup company Glossier a couple of years ago. And Glossier has since like really kind of fallen out of fashion because really insane, colorful makeup is now in. So that seems to me to be true there. I'm not sure though, like in fiction, which is kind of the thing that I know the most about, I think we're still seeing lots of sparse 150-page novels with lots of white space between the chunks that are about how I live in Brooklyn in short sentences, and I wish that would stop.
Thank you for such a great read. And you include several like deeply personal examples in vulnerable ways. And I was just wondering, were you born knowing how to do that? Or how did you learn what to select while creating a narrative that still seems to center the reader's experience?
I think I was definitely born shameless, so that helps. Beyond that, I think it's kind of just a matter of intuition, like reading a lot of things and thinking about what works and what doesn't work, like especially because my job is reading nonfiction stuff. I guess I got my job after I finished the book. But before that, I was already a book critic. So I read a lot of memoirs where I was like, this is just pointless oversharing to no end. It makes no philosophical point. It doesn't seem like it generalizes. And so after reading enough of those, I was like, don't do this. Note to self. Kind of that's how. But thank you so much for your kind words. Hi.
Hello. How's it going?
Great to see you.
You too. Another preoccupation besides the entanglement between religion and politics that I can hear from the book, and that I also know that you have, is that of religion and art, and maybe even religion and literature. And so religion in literature is often seen as like a historical moment where literature or things that came before the novel were very didactic and kind of maybe the things that you're saying that should be bracketed or we should kind of swerve away from or maybe contrast with the forms that you're interested in. I'm wondering if there are any examples that you can think of that maybe complicate that narrative or that maybe come up in the book that you're kind of interested in.
Of like didactic art that works?
Or overlaps between your interests in religion and literature that are interesting to you or maybe that are just purely didactic. Maybe those two things don't go together. But since they're such big themes in the book, yeah.
This may not be a satisfying answer to someone who knows so much about religion. Nate knows a lot more than I do. But I think I'm interested particularly in mysticism. Like mystics are the figures that keep coming up in the book. The title comes from the Dutch mystic, the Dutch medieval mystic Hedwig of Brabant, who is an amazing sumptuous poet, and Simone Weil is a mystic, and Catherine of Siena is in one of the essays. So I think the common thread for me is that both literature and religion represent a desire for more than the world can provide, and they reflect a dissatisfaction with human finitude. And this is why I think that people turn to religion, or like Simone Weil and a lot of these other mystics who starve themselves, at least the way I read them, is that they're doing that because they're waiting for a kind of fulfillment that isn't possible on earth, a kind of satiation that they can only get elsewhere. And although I love to eat, that's kind of my approach to reading literature. It's I'm wanting to consume more than this world can provide.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, congratulations, first of all.
Thank you. Hello.
I had a question about how and when we should discipline our desires within the context of political economy specifically. So you've talked a little bit about Rawls. And the position you kind of explained just now and talk about in your book is that the difference principle, this idea that inequality is only tolerable to the extent that it benefits the least among us, is an idea that's best reserved for the political sphere. And in our private lives, we ought to be able to pursue excess, gratuitousness freely. But to my mind, there's a kind of blurriness between public and private in many respects, even in the aesthetic sense. For instance, in the chapter you're talking about minimalism, if you are somebody who lives in a detached single-family home with a very large lawn and a garden you tend to, and inside it's cluttered and you've got knickknacks and tchotchkes and heirlooms and family photos on the wall, you seem to be living a kind of life that is in accordance with the principle you defend in the book, certainly more than somebody who lives in a studio apartment that they've Marie Kondoed to death with autofiction on the shelves, right?
God forbid.
And yet, with regards to like material inequality, the second person is consuming less in certain respects or taking up less space to the point where the state might have an interest, if it wants to address inequality, in nudging people in that direction. So when you have that kind of a divide and you have those kinds of inequalities, and when you think the state should act, to what extent should it take seriously the need for pleasure and excess of the kind you defend? And in instances when the state is not going to act, to what extent should we ourselves think about disciplining our own desires to the end of advancing material equality?
Thank you, Asita. That's a really good question and makes me have flashbacks to when I went to conferences in graduate school. I'll do my best to answer. So I think that the state should not promote any particular end. I'm a committed liberal, and what distinguishes John Rawls from some other political philosophers is he's an anti-perfectionist, which is to say he does not believe that it is the state's job to devise and impose a particular conception of the good life. And I have a very particular conception of the good life, one in which beauty is central, but others may not agree. So I think it's the state's job to ensure that everyone has the resources to pursue a life full of beauty without forcing people who don't think that that is what the good life is to do that. So I don't think that the state should be actively pursuing beauty, but maybe it should be fun. There should be like funding that you can apply for to like do artistic projects. There should be accessible aesthetic education, things like that should be available. I think another answer to the question is just that I don't think that what I say about beauty and the good of pursuing it exhausts the realm of obligations and responsibilities that you have. So I think it's consistent to say that you have aesthetic reasons to pursue beauty, but you might also have political obligations to ensure that conditions of justice obtain. I think that you do have both of those things and that they needn't conflict with one another. And if they do, it might even be the case that the political obligations take precedence over the aesthetic I wouldn't want to say obligations, that's strong, but the aesthetic reasons that you have. But I think most of the time the two are consistent, and so there's no reason not to pursue both. Finally, I think a lot of the resources that my book promotes being excessive about are not finite, so they're not the kind of thing that one person having more of them would require that someone else have less of them. It's like in the chapter on mindfulness, I claim that people who are proponents of mindfulness, whose books I read, they want you to kind of empty your mind of thoughts and obsessions and fixations and have a very minimal mental landscape. But I think like we can all have obsession. That's not the kind of thing where if Jeff Bezos has a lot of obsession, the rest of us can't. We can all obsess. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for coming out. So I wanted to ask a question about your essay in the New Yorker, All Good Sex is Body Horror, which I absolutely loved.
Thank you.
And one of the things that I loved so much about it was your argument for the erotic, the truly erotic, not just the sexual, as transformative in some way. So I kind of wondered, when you're thinking about our current cultural landscape and how we think about sex in our current cultural landscape, how do you think that we can incorporate that into our real lives in a way that's going to actually make the erotic transformative?
I mean, that's a hard question because this verges on sort of like me giving people going on dates advice territory, which I'm not sure is my forte. But I mean, I do think that, controversial opinion, I suppose, but like I do think that dating apps, for example, which encourage you to encounter somebody in a way where you have a lot of control over them, you are not going to encounter anything unexpected. If you see something that you don't like or that you might not immediately be attracted to, you can just swipe past it. I think that kind of setting aside that way of looking at people would be helpful in our culture because, in my view, eroticism is about surprise and being jolted out of yourself, and that can only happen if you're surprised by an encounter with somebody, which isn't to say, of course, that like that can't happen with somebody that you meet on a dating app, but that perhaps dating apps foster a way of thinking in which you're prepared for everything that you encounter and you kind of have expectations and you never have any reason to deviate from the expectations or to surprise yourself or to challenge yourself or to allow your desires to be transformed. Because it's kind of like online shopping or whatever, and you can just like customize the person you go on a date with the way you would a pair of jeans. So I think moving away from dating apps would be one concrete policy that I would maybe recommend, although I'm not really a concrete policy recommender.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. Are you going to be doing signings?
I think I'm doing signings. Yeah. Okay.
You should buy Becca's book, which is fantastic. It will change your life, I promise. It will be transformative. And yeah, so I think that in order to do that, we're best. Checkout's out in the front, and then Becca's going to be over here. And you should go and do that, and then you should get it signed. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for